Yeah,
host for
great.
sharing.
There we go. Thanks.
Thanks so.
Um, yeah, so it's lovely to be here with all of you, some familiar faces, some of you that I don't know. So the plan for today is to talk about adult development and the stages of adult development, and to bring together different psychological and spiritual views on stages of development within an Enneagram context. So the way in which I've kind of planned the session is to share a couple of thoughts and ideas to orientate us to the topic. We'll have quite a few breakout sessions in which we'll discuss some of it, some of the things we will also break in the middle as per normal. Um, and I'm happy to share some of the slides so you don't have to scribble too ferociously. I'll share that with Renata afterwards to distribute to everyone that's here and everyone in the group that can't make it. So that's the rough plan for today. I was just saying as I came into the room that I am in recovery from COVID. So I do at times lose my train of thought and my language a little bit still, even though most of the symptoms have cleared up. So if I seem really daft at points, please just bear with me to some extent. Yeah, I guess there's a lot I could say. Not all of it might be helpful in orientating you to who I am. Maybe one or two just useful things. I have been working with the Enneagram now in different ways since 2006, and have had the privilege of teaching some of the people that are here on this call, and to have been taught by some of the people that are here on this call, and have, yeah, have this very interesting, I think my relationship with the Enneagram has gone through many different phases. um, I'm open to, maybe just as a way of helping you all get to know me a little bit, to just maybe say if there are two or three questions from the community about who I am or things you want to know about me, then maybe that's the best way of introducing myself. I never know what people want to know and don't want to know. So just unmute yourself and pop a question in, and we'll just do maximum of three of those questions, and then we'll get started with the topic.
Lynn, you want to ask a question?
Oh, I'm following rules. I just unmuted myself, but I do have a question. Curious to know your professional background, Lucille. Are you a therapist or um, a professor, or as well as an Enneagram practitioner?
Thanks, Lynn. So my primary professional identity is as an organization development practitioner. So I work in OD, and I have some psychological training. I have some training in complexity theory. I have some coaching training. But my primary identity is as an OD practitioner. And I've had the privilege of doing kind of organizational systems maturation work for most of my career. Um, yeah, some of the people here have worked with me in the worldview capacity, and some of us have worked on other projects together.
Thank you.
I want to add something to that
Mm.
that Lucille didn't say, is that she's a creative process genius, and in her leadership work gets people to do the most interesting and inspiring things that I've ever been exposed to. And from rituals to poetry to nature walks, wrestling with their own shadows in the dark up mountains at night. So yeah, if you're ever looking for somebody to give you creative process ideas, Lucille's the one.
Thanks, Ingrid. In another part of my professional capacity, I am a wilderness guide or a vision fasting facilitator. So I run processes on the land, which are extended periods of fasting and being in nature. So that's the other part of my professional identity. I run a couple of those each year. Yeah. Anything else anyone wants to know, or very trusting group? Let's just jump in.
Lucille, sorry, darling. I think we just have a very rare thing in this particular call because many of the people in the group use the IQ9 questionnaire and know that Dirk, I don't know if you can see, Dirk doesn't have his camera on at the moment, that Dirk Klutter is in the house. So for those of you who have done IQ9, you might be familiar with Dirk. And I don't think it needs to be a secret that Lucille and Dirk were the co-founders and creators of the IQ9. So that would be meaningful for many of the people here, just in terms of your introduction, Lucille, so I don't know if you want to just, I mean, I don't know what more there is to say, but yeah, I'm so thrilled that Dirk's with us, which is a first, and that you're both together here, and you were both together in the creation of the IQ9. So I think that would establish huge credibility for most of the people here in terms of your experience with the Enneagram.
Great, thanks. As you probably know, I'm no longer with IQ9, but yeah, I was part of that birth of that journey with Dirk many years ago.
I want to add one more thing because you glossed over it too quickly. The Vision Quest journeys that Lucille runs in the mountains north of Cape Town, absolutely mind-blowing and life-changing. And if you're interested in ever doing a Vision Quest, it's a thing to be done. I did one with her and Bukelwa, her partner, a Sangoma, in November last year, and I can say it was truly life-changing. So if that is calling you, you know who to speak to. Your website's www.gentlespirit.co.za.
Yeah,
So look up
absolutely.
Gentle Spirit Vision Quests, yeah, and do it.
Yeah, Ingrid was one of the brave people in November that went out into the mountains to fast for 4.5 days while crying for her vision. So yeah, glad to have brought you back alive, Ingrid. That's always our greatest achievement when we do this kind of work. Bring everyone back alive.
This is Chris. Ingrid, would you like to do my marketing for me? You're doing a great job for Lucille at the moment.
I do it with absolute sincerity and authenticity, so I first have to evaluate how legit you are.
Cool. So let's maybe get started on today's topic, adult development. And I want to start us off in a maybe a slightly different place. And I'd like to invite everyone on the call to participate in this. And what I'd like you to do is in your chat box to type your personal answer to this question. What is the purpose of the Enneagram? There are no right or wrong answers, but what is the purpose of the Enneagram? I'm seeing some interesting answers come up. I'll just take a moment before I read some of them aloud. Maybe you want to also just take a look at what's in the chat box. Some of the things that maybe strike me, the word discover, that comes up quite a lot. See the word giving direction, awareness, insight, develop to essence, working towards essence, self-insight, awareness, rediscover your true self, discover. So discover, self-awareness and growth, wake us up, self-discovery. Great. So there's some lovely thoughts coming through here. I see transformation, maturity and discovery, waking up from the trance, determine what motivates a person. Brilliant. So there aren't any wrong or right answers to this. And I think the Enneagram is many things to many people at many different points in time. But part of the story of adult stage development or adult development theory, even human development theory beyond that. If we bring that into conversation with the Enneagram, part of the way in which I think about the Enneagram is that the purpose of the Enneagram is development and growth. Yes, there are many other things that happen along the way, like finding my type or getting some self-awareness. All of those are things that are part and parcel of the development and growth journey. But if we're using the Enneagram for a purpose that is other than supporting people's growth and development, we may only be working with a really small part of the Enneagram. And the invitation here today is to open yourself up to thinking about the Enneagram as a transformative or a developmental tool in a variety of different ways. And there are many different words we use in the Enneagram and also more broadly in psychology and personal development work and coaching around this topic. We say growth, we say development, but we also say sometimes levels of awareness, levels of integration, levels of maturity, levels of consciousness. All of those things, or stages of development, have in common with each other that they speak of almost different levels, different stages, or a higher or a lower in some kind of way. And that really brings us into conversation with the topic of adult development stage theories, and a shorthand that I'll use for that today is the term vertical development. So vertical development would say, I'm going from one stage to the next, either up or down in a stage-based theory in some kind of way. So it's great to use the Enneagram to type, but the Enneagram is there for much more of that too. So I'm just going to share, let me just quickly share my screen here. There's a couple of thoughts I want to share with you before we get into our first conversation. Let me just see, sorry, it's not in presentation mode, is it? There we go. Some of you may be very familiar with the Enneagram of Personality. Now, the Enneagram of Personality is where Enneagram 1 represents the perspective of the reformer or the perfectionist or whatever language you want to use, and there's a personality archetype connected to that. And maybe before I go deeper into the share, just with a show of hands, I'd love to see, and just put your hand up if you are familiar with the concept of the Process Enneagram. Now, the Process Enneagram is where 1 does not mean perfectionist. It means a certain step in a developmental journey. So I see a couple of hands going up here, but also quite a few of the hands not up yet. So today I want to start our talk by talking a little bit about a process orientation to the Enneagram. And for those of you that work exclusively with a personality Enneagram, your biggest mindset change when we work with the Enneagram of Process is to not call in everything you know about Enneagram 1 when we say step 1 of the process, because we're not in the archetypal or personality Enneagram at this point in time. It speaks more to developmental processes or developmental stages. And there's much less written about it. A lot of Gurdjieff's original work is around the Process Enneagram, and there are some other, and a lot of Gurdjieffian training is about using the Process Enneagram, and a lot of that isn't written up and is quite secretive. And today I'm going to just talk about the Process Enneagram a little bit, and then as we continue into the talk, I'm going to bring the personality and Process Enneagrams together again to make sense. So when we talk about the Enneagram of Process, we orientate ourselves to say personality Enneagram is half of the story. This is the other half of the story, the journey of development and how that works. And it's useful to put some of the personality parts aside for now. So when we work with the Enneagram of Process, I'm just going to use my annotation tool here. There are different ways in which we can work with the Enneagram of Process. But basically, if we use the outer journey of the Enneagram of Process, there's the process of devolution or falling from God and oneness into our human forms, losing touch with essence, and then the journey back that returns us back to oneness and God, whatever language you want to use. So that is a stage by stage, a step journey, and you can use the outer circle. And all of these points would represent significant transformation points. The point between Enneagram 4 and 5 also represents something significantly. And we work here in the devolving journey from 9 to 1 and the evolving or evolutionary return journey from 1 back to 9. So that's one way in which we can think of the process Enneagram. It's the outer journey of the Enneagram on the circle. Then in the inner journey of the Enneagram, we can use either the structure of the law of 3, 9, 3, and 6 that allows us to really make sense of the process of creation. Sandra Maitri also speaks about the way in which we lose touch with essence step by step. She says, starting from 9, then going to 6, then going to 3, we lose touch with essence. And in some of the work that we do in working with the Enneagram as a creation or balancing process, that inner triangle can then help us disconnect from ego by going from 9 to 3 to 6. This is the journey of the law of 3. And then there's the discontinuous Enneagram journey. And that's the one that's on the inner hexad, 1 to 4 to 2 to 8 to 5 to 7 to 1. And the other way around. So I'm not going to explain too much how all of that works at this point in time, but there's also a way in which we can play with the construct of time in a discontinuous way to allow us to work with that. So for example, if I have an individual in their stages of development that sits roughly here at Enneagram 4, and now I'm not meaning that they are an Enneagram 4 in the personality Enneagram, meaning they're in this stage of development, and they are dealing with a trauma from long ago, I might get them to walk the line from 4 to 1, or even slide their fingers on the symbol of the Enneagram from 4 to 1 to deal with an old childhood trauma, which might have sat in the first phase of development. And even further back, if I want to call in the help of their ancestors to support that development or go into intergenerational trauma, I might walk them back even further into 7, into past generations, things that happened outside of their lifetime, and deep into multi-generational trauma. I might even walk them all the way to 5, and then return back into the present moment. So in some way, if we use some of the things that happened for us in the short meditation, we could represent that here on the Enneagram as well. I can pick any point in time, but let's say we're here at point 2 in the present moment. My suitcase in the recent past would be at Enneagram 1, and my suitcase of the recent or the soon future would be at Enneagram 3. Distant past might go back further, depending on how much further I want to go back, and into the future, I'd work this way around. So that just gives you a start of a sense of thinking about the Enneagram as a process point. We can break any Enneagram, any process, whether it's a project I'm working on, whether it's the days of the week, whether it's a relationship. I can essentially break that up into 7 different steps, and I would do that by making my own distinctions, unless those distinctions exist already, like the days of the week. And I would put the first step of the process at 1, the second at 2, the third at 4. We don't use the inner triangle except for point 9 in this 7-step process. Another step at 5, 1 at 7, 1 at 8, and the last step is at 9. And I can then map my journey and work with that in a certain way. Doesn't have to make sense right now. I'm just trying to get your mind into process groove, if that makes sense. So That gives you a little bit of an idea. The next thing, if we work with the Enneagram of Process, is to understand that this flat representation of the Enneagram that we have on the picture here is what we call the beginner's or two-dimensional symbol of the Enneagram. It's a flat symbol of the Enneagram. If you want to work with the Enneagram as a full process model, you have to think of the Enneagram as a three-dimensional model. So you have to think of that circle as a sphere above us and a sphere below us. You can think of the triangles as intersecting triangles upwards and downwards. That symbol is called a Merkaba. And you can start thinking about the devolving process from the top of the Enneagram, spiraling around to the bottom of the Enneagram in a circle and back up. So the circle becomes more three-dimensional. And when we start thinking about the Enneagram in this three-dimensional way, it becomes the symbol of perpetual growth or perpetual movement, because of course we can evolve and devolve both. But it becomes a symbol of perpetual movement. And it can help us make sense of this whole journey of falling from essence or God or oneness. People have different languaging for this, and the return process. So another way of putting what I've already illustrated is the outer circle, 1, 2, 3, 4. If I follow those steps sequentially, they represent a conventional flow of time or sequential steps in a process. If we breaking up a project into process steps, that would be the kind of process steps that you get from studying project management. First you do this, then you do that, then you do that. The inner hexad, the 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1, that journey is the law of discontinuity, and it's kind of a magical sequence or a sequence of time travel. And that would allow you to do things out of sequence. So if I'm doing a project, I'm going to do step 1, and then I'm going to do something crazy. I'm not going to do the second step. I'm going to go to the third step, which sits here at Enneagram 4. That doesn't have to make sense now, but think of the inner hexad as a way in which we can work discontinuously or magically with the sequence of things. And then the inner triangle, 9, 3, 6, represents the law of creation. And in that process, Enneagram 3 and 6 in particular represent shock points. Blake, in his writing, refers to them as gaping mouths, where the external actually has the opportunity to come into our internal world. And there are very few opportunities for the external world to significantly mess or mess with is maybe a negative connotation, but transform, reconfigure, bring in other energies that's completely unrelated to our process, and to transform things in ways that, if we're not expecting it, can be quite disruptive. They're also points of balance. And so that refers to what we work with in the Enneagram, the different laws of 1, 3, 7, which might be a topic for a whole different conversation here. So I'm just going to stop for 1 second. It's a rabbit hole. We're in a rabbit hole. If some of the stuff that I've said now doesn't make any sense at all, you can park it. But the main thing that I want you to get is there's more than one way of working with the Enneagram, and just working with personality archetypes gives you only half of the story. And there's a whole different half. We're going to explore a particular way of applying the Process Enneagram to stages of adult development today. But at least it maybe starts messing with your certainty. In some ways, I think that's my definition of good teaching, is it makes you less certain rather than more certain about what you know. So just an opportunity. Just unmute yourself if you have 1 or 2 questions or even 1 or 2 comments. Some of you are familiar with some of the process stuff, so please feel free to chip in here.
I'm excited.
Oh, sorry. Lucille, this is Melissa O'Mara, and I'm so thrilled that I was able to get here today, because this vertical development work is of individuals and organizations is what fascinates me the most, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. And I'm a big fan also of Eric Blileson's book, Essential Wholeness, which I discovered maybe 6 to 12 months ago. So I don't know if you know Eric. or if he's probably interviewed for you, but really excited about the next few hours. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Melissa. Lynn, you also had something you wanted to add? And then
No,
Ingrid.
just to say I'm excited.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to say something because when you said you're messing with our brains, there's this wonderful prayer by Teilhard de Chardin, who's one of the most important process theologians, and it just connects so beautifully with what you're saying. It says, "Blessed be you, mighty matter, irresistible march of evolution, reality ever newborn, you who by constantly shattering our mental categories force us to go ever further and further in our pursuit of the truth." So thank you for doing it.
And I think that's a, yeah.
Sorry, Lucille. Mary's got a question in the chat just around where we could read more about this.
Mary, I will put together a little bit of a reading list for you as we, in the slides that we share afterwards. I think Blake's book on the Enneagram is probably, it's a very dense read, but it's a very good starting point. If you want a very pragmatic and slightly different application, there's also, see now this is where my mental fog is against me at this point in time, but there's someone help me out here. The Process Enneagram, which works with 825 as self-organizing, and who is the author that wrote that? It's The Spiritual Dance or something is the name of the book. It's an Australian guy. The name will come to me, but I'll put a reading list together for you. Unfortunately, a lot of the reading around this, or you have to go back to Ouspensky's work that talks about his times with Gurdjieff. A lot of this is taught in Gurdjieffian teachings, and they don't write things down. It's quite, so you might want to join a Gurdjieffian group, although that might be a mighty strange experience for a lot of people who work with the personality Enneagram. And then, of course, there's a lot of work that Uranio Paes has done, and that's available on the Chestnut Paes Academy. Some talks by him would be a really good starting point. Yeah. Good. So I'm going to jump back in and get us into exactly what Ingrid's reading took us to, this idea of shattering our paradigms. So when we work with this idea of the purpose of the Enneagram is our growth and development, there are two kinds of development that we can work with here. Yeah. The first is maybe the slightly better known version of development. It's slightly more conventional development. It's called horizontal development. And Suzanne Cook-Reuter calls this lateral expansion. Ken Wilber calls it translation from an integral perspective. But lateral expansion is where you remain within the paradigm that you're in, and you develop new skills or add additional information or additional cleverness, or you transfer your skills that you have in one area and you take it into another area and you translating. But I'm not changing my paradigm or my view of the world. The way in which I see the world remains fairly static, and my assumptions about how the world works remain fairly static. So an example of lateral expansion would be, I have spent 10 years learning a lot about how to manage people in a leadership role in a conventional corporate job. And I then go and I change careers. I leave the corporate and I become a consultant, and I teach other people how to work better with people. I'm translating my skill into a new area, but my paradigm hasn't really shifted. I still look at the world in a similar way. Or I have a particular skill with analysis, and I've also always used that skill for financing. And then I learn how to also use that an analytical skill to work with big data or do statistics or analyze recipes or be Marie Kondo and tell people how to organize their homes, really. You know, I have analytical skills, I'm translating it, but my worldview stays fairly static. And that's what a lot of development is about, actually, and there's a real use for it. We need to learn how to apply and translate skills into multiple areas. I'm not going to talk much about horizontal development for the rest of the session, but I need you to have that in frame, because what I want us to talk about is vertical development. Now, vertical development is the process whereby my actual worldview, the paradigm from which I see the world, transforms itself. Now, if it's becoming more integrated, takes in more of the world, we generally call this the upward vertical development move, or downwards. Sometimes in psychological terms is called regression. Valerie Livesay has spoken about this as fallback. But that's the process where I actually go back to an earlier perspective or an earlier paradigm in my life because of circumstances and things that are happening around me. And I think there's no better time to talk about this than now, given where the world's been at in the last while. You've probably seen in yourself and in your clients, maybe in your family members, people that have regressed. And even though they've had more mature behaviors, they've gone back and now they're a version of their 24-year-old selves again, even though they're in their 50s. You've seen leaders go from saying, I'm a participative leader, I like to hear what people say, to saying my way or the highway, it's all about survival. I don't have time for all that nice people crap anymore. That's a form of vertical development that is in the downwards trajectory. So we're starting to get this idea of vertical and horizontal development. And I'm going to give you 3 metaphors that helps you understand the vertical development idea a little bit better, and use the metaphor. So people have different metaphors that they connect to. So I'm giving you 3 and one of them will maybe land for you. The first and the simplest is the idea of climbing a mountain. Yeah. If you are at the bottom of the mountain and you look around, there's quite a lot you can see, right? There's the detail of the vegetation that you can see, but your sense of the horizon is not that far. You can only see in your immediate environment, and you can probably see that in quite a lot of detail. As I develop vertically, it's like the process of climbing the mountain. Not only does the landscape change and what I'm able to see, so if I'm at the bottom of Mount Kilimanjaro versus the top, the one, well, these days Kilimanjaro doesn't even have snow that often, but sometimes it still does. I have a barren landscape with snow, while at the bottom I'm in a jungle. You know, it's a very different environment and territory that I'm in. But also the higher up I go, the further my horizon becomes. Now that horizon can be a time horizon. It can be the amount of complexity that I can work with and I can deal with. It's also my capacity for anxiety and existential anxiety. In spiritual terms, you might say how far I can extend my energetic field, and how aware I am of that might become bigger the more developed I am. But think of this as climbing a mountain. Another metaphor that's often used, horizontal, if we think of myself as a vessel, like a glass, horizontal development would be the process of changing what I put into the glass. Yeah, so if I'm always drinking water, I might chuck out the water and put some orange juice in there, or maybe even a vodka, who knows? There's a lot of different things I can put in that little glass. Vertical development is the process of making the actual vessel bigger. So I can put a whole lot more water or orange juice or vodka into that glass, and it's not the same glass anymore. It's expanded. There's space for a lot more in it. And therefore, there's more information and different types of information that can go into this glass. The third is to use the metaphor of a house. And I know Thomas Merton is one of the people who's used this, a version of this metaphor as well, but it's this idea of I I am living in, and this is my life, in the current paradigm, my little room in a house. Now, that can be seen as my stage of development or my stage of maturity in the vertical process. Now, when I'm doing horizontal development, I'm decorating my room. I'm putting a pot plant here, I'm putting a couch there, I'm deciding to change the colors of the walls. There's a lot I can do with that. But if I'm talking about vertical development, one day I might notice somewhere in the corner a door that I've never seen before. And maybe that door is locked. Maybe at some point in time, I find a key somewhere and I unlock that door and I stick my head tentatively through it. And wow, there's a staircase to a whole different part of the house that I never knew existed. And as I grow and develop and maybe gather my courage, I might even go up that staircase and go and check out what is in the next room. And maybe I just visit it for a short while and then I go back to the comfort of my decorated room, my center of gravity. And maybe over time I go and I decorate that other room and now I have 2 rooms to live in. And so the journey goes. You know, I might even find a 3rd room or a 4th room. And before I know it, I have a palace that I'm living in. And the process of fallback or regression might be the process where one day I want to go to the next floor and the doors just disappeared, or I've lost the key because I was really stressed and I left things and I've left my keys in the fridge once. That took quite a while to find. I left my keys in the fridge and I can't get to this other story anymore. I can't get to the other room, so I've regressed into it. So those are some useful metaphors for the process of vertical development. Most of the words that we've already used in psychology, we talk about identity or maturation. In spirituality, we maybe talk about consciousness or awareness. And in the Enneagram, we talk about integration or health. Sometimes we even talk in the wisdom traditions of more wise people or the development of wisdom. The important thing when we're talking about vertical development, though, is that we're not talking about a once-off experience. That is an elevated state, and it's not so much a center of gravity or a place that I'm living. So I might, through a spiritual experience or through an amazing workshop that I go through or through great coaching or therapy, have these moments of awareness. But if they fade back again, it doesn't necessarily represent a stage jump in maturity. It's just that I've had this moment of insight somewhere along the way. So I want us to get into groups to discuss some of our personal experiences around vertical development. But maybe before we do that, any questions or comments?
Lucille, you just make me host. Lucille, just make me host so I can set up the breakout rooms.
Okay, I'll do that. Yes, I'll do that.
So Lucille, I do
in the
have a
particip-
question this time.
Yes.
Is it okay to go?
Yes, go for it.
So something that's coming to mind for me is, and outside of the political frame, I hope I won't offend anybody, but if we look at something that's happened in the last 4 years under Mr. Trump, would we say we've actually moved toward regression?
Lynn, I think it's fabulous if sometimes in our comments we offend people, because it means we're bumping up against edges of learning. So if anyone is offended, that's probably great. It means that you have an opportunity to learn. Lynn, there are different perspectives on this. There has been a study that's correlated stages of development with political affiliation. And the results are interesting and also potentially controversial. So generally, so this is a generalization, but generally there is a swing towards more liberal ideas with stages of development, although you have some liberals who are fully asleep. But if you have a mass population that's incredibly conservative, often that I don't know how to say this nicely, but if you wanted to be really evil, you could predict how people would vote based on stages of maturity. That's the first thing. And the second thing I would say is my personal opinion, which doesn't have to be everyone's opinion, is that I think not just Trump, but general right-wing ideologies all across the world that's become quite popular politically in many different countries, from Brazil through to the UK and other parts of the world, does represent a little bit of a fallback position. But that's just my opinion, and people are welcome to have their own on that. It's a good application though.
Thanks.
And at the same time, any kind of extremist and fundamentalist idea that says you're right and I'm wrong, well, I'm right and you're wrong, that you get as much in the Democrats as you get on the side of the Republicans, is actually quite a problematic position, because the moment you get into a conforming view where it's you against me and this group in group and that out group, and you polarize things, that positioning is positioning that is less mature than the integrating perspective that tries to find points of integration, or sees it as a polarity rather than a binary.
Okay, and then following on from that, the kind of world environment that we're on right now, is this one of these shock things that are blowing up our paradigms, that are blowing up our norms, and actually gives us the capacity for vertical growth?
There are two thoughts that come to mind that might be useful. So from a process perspective, one of the ways in which we can use that process perspective of the Enneagram that's been applied, even though maybe not from an Enneagram perspective, is the idea of the clock of the world. Yeah, that says we're less than a minute away from the end of civilization, from the beginning of the history of life on Earth to where we are now. We're a minute from doom. That doomsday clock scenario is an idea of tracking across time on a process basis, maybe something that one can put onto an Enneagram process map as well. I will for a moment answer from a different perspective to the Enneagram. Someone like, well, there are many different people that specialize in tracking the stages of a civilization. And where we are at the moment, according to the application of some of those stage models of civilization, would say that we are at the end of a cycle of civilization. So you had a Babylonian cycle, for example, at some point in time. So we're at the end of this a kind of Western industrialist cycle. So we're actually well beyond the shock points and into the place of civilization breakdown, and a new version of civilization will in some way come to the forefront as a result of where we are at. The problem with this model is, up to now, civilizations have mostly been more regionalized, and we are now in a more integrated global society. And so the implication of the end of a more global phase of civilization might have more disastrous consequences from an environmental perspective. So I think we're beyond shock points. The shock points happened a couple of generations ago.
Thank you.
But once again, that's just my maybe slightly problematic opinion. Yeah. So as people are coming back in, this is what I'd like you to discuss in your group. And if you only get time for the first part, then only go for that. But maybe the second question strikes you a little bit more today, and you can work with either or both. So the first question is, think of an example of a developmental or stage change, paradigm shift, a vertical step in your life that was a shift up. So what you see as a more developed stage, where you went from this stage to that stage in your life. And first thing, just you know, share a little bit of how you make sense of it, what you think enabled or supported or led to the shift. But then importantly, and this is important, that you articulate, how did my worldview or my identity or my paradigm change? So it's like a little bit like those diet pictures, your before and after picture. If it's just, I had this awareness and then my life continued exactly the same, then maybe that was just an event as opposed to a stage change. And you can also share some more. What changed in the way in which I lived my life as a result of this? So it's not just how did my worldview change, but what in my life changed? If you want to go for the second part of the question, it's the same thing, but we're talking about regression. And I find that this question has tickled people quite a lot as a result of 2020. So think of an example of a time of fallback or regression, so a shift to an earlier stage of consciousness or maturity. And what do you think led to this time of fallback? Once again, I'm not so much interested in the day that you lost your shit for 5 seconds and then it was fine again. You know, so really more of a stage change. You know, I stayed there for a couple of weeks or even a couple of years. I regressed. And how did this regression express itself in terms of my behaviors, my emotions, my thought patterns, my mental patterns, and my spirituality? And what helped me recover if I have? Maybe I haven't recovered yet. So that's also okay. No judgment. I mean, there is something about all of us. It's not a one-way journey. It's not a one-way stairway to heaven, this thing. We're really talking about fluidity in our own stage of maturity. And then just an additional invitation, let's not think about childhood. We're talking about adult development here. So think of examples from your adult life. And in your small group, you can listen for patterns in the sharing. Try and make sense of what you hear in the collective. Yeah, so that's the invitation. If you want to take a quick screenshot of this, you can, if that would be helpful. But broadly, talk about a stage change that stuck, or a regression that stayed with you for a while, and make sense of how it changed you. And then listen for patterns in the sharing. And my suggestion is that we take 20 minutes for the sharing. Does that sound good, Renata?
Sounds great. Thank you. All right. Any questions before we go into breakout?
We'll come back and discuss patterns and answer questions once we come back into the group.
Perfect. Lucille, the Zoom's put you into a room, but feel free to stay and come out and move around rooms. You should be able to as co-host.
Thanks.
All right. So enjoy your chats, and we'll see you back in 20 minutes, and then we'll do some Q&A and take a tea break. So see you in a bit. And know that you can call moderator if you want to call Lucille to come and support you in your chat. So into breakouts in 3, 2, 1. Oh, you're unassigned. Hold on, Melissa, Lynn, and Dion. Let me assign you, I don't know why, to a room.
Maybe assign one of them to the room that I was in,
I added a room specifically because I knew that some people were still coming in. So, oh, it didn't put you into a room. Or did
I went there. I came out again. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I added a room because I knew I'd need to assign people to an extra room. So Melissa should be going now. Must be her connection. This is such an amazing, such a gift, Lucille. Thank you. This is
Am I making sense, Renata? I mean, this is my first facilitation since last year. I haven't been able to speak for most of January, so I feel...
Oh, my word.
Yeah, so it's making sense.
Hectic. Yes, but I love that when you say, like, if it doesn't make sense yet, that's fine, you know, because people need that comfort. They need that reassurance. Not sure what's going on with Melissa. She's in America, so maybe, and maybe she's just, her connection's not great. Let me see if I shuffle her, if that helps. Oh, there we go. Oh, she's dropped off.
No, she's in room 11. If you look at the breakout.
Oh, there. Now she is. Yeah, great. Okay, awesome. Okay, good. You can also see the breakouts.
Yeah, I can.
All right. Now Michelle and Sarita are just together alone. I wonder if I should, if they're happy with that, or if they want to be in a bigger group. I'm sure they'll be fine, just two of them. I know them both, and they both probably got a lot to say.
Cool. So then it should be fine. How have you been, Renata? Do you want to just stop the recording for it or pause the recording?
Yes, good idea.
We will do kind of Q&A, a little bit of Q&A and a little bit more teaching after the tea break. But before we go on tea, just maybe an invitation for 3 observations. What struck you about the conversation you just had, or any meta-narratives or things you noticed in across the different things that were shared? Let's just get maybe 3 people to share, and then we'll go for tea. You can just unmute and pop in.
So I found quite interesting from a looking at trends and themes in our group. Typically, the upward movement was very much about intentional learning, and the downward was life happening. Typically, trauma or external. So the internal was the up, and and life happening was often what took us down.
That's an interesting observation, Lee. The term that's used in vertical development work for that downward movement is called contextual gravitational pull. It's like a very fancy word for it, but that thing of circumstances, the world, I mean, if you think of the contextual gravitational pull of 2020, whether it's social, physical health, political, I mean, everywhere in the world, there was just like this magnet that pulled everyone, wanted to pull everyone into a regressive space. So that's one of the things. It's interesting, though, that if you look at the literature around upwards movement, absolutely intentional growth is one of the things that allows us to do that. But there is the opportunity, and some paradigm reframes come from personal tragedy as well. So if you think of the individual who's at a very early stage of maturity where everything's just me and my group and my norms, and I might be 40, but I'm still living in the town where I grew up with the friends that I always had, having the same drink in the same pub and the same conversation. And I've never had great loss and tragedy. And all of a sudden, my parents pass away and I lose my job. That might be part of what enables a reframe, or invites, let's not say enables, invites a reframe. It disrupts the sense making sufficiently for us to become unstuck. At a certain stage of maturity, when we're talking of later stages of development, no matter how much context throws at me, it's not going to help me develop. It's only intentional development that will, though. But thanks, great input, Lee. Anyone else that would like to offer something? Ingrid?
Yeah, I think I was with Ken and Chris, and we were talking about the metaphor that I used, that Chris said he identified with as well, was a kind of shattering. That when one has a vertical shift upwards, there's a shattering of old identities and paradigms that, as Chris says, there's a mixture of pain and euphoria, because at the same time as experiencing a liberation, there's a lot that we have to let go of that gave us an illusion of security at the lower stages. So maybe you can talk to that a bit.
I think that's a very useful metaphor. And part of what it helps us to connect to is that upward vertical development is not necessarily always just a spiral towards more happiness, a transcendence into things being easier and everything becomes Denmark in life, which is apparently the happiest nation in the world. Actually, what happens is with each successive reframe, I fit in less into the conventional world. And I'm also opening myself up to experiencing more of the world as it is rather than as I wish for it to be. And what that means is I have to hold more of the pain as well as more of the ecstasy in some kind of way. So the story, and this is part of what we'll talk about after tea, that spiritual development is a form of transcendent enlightenment that becomes easier, is a view that doesn't take the psychological and existential development process into consideration. You need to merge those two perspectives in many different ways, because some development, in fact, a lot of development, is incredibly painful. And if you think of that process of a new paradigm coming into play in a relationship system that's used to you believing and thinking in the old way and behaving in the old way, it's incredibly disruptive, and people can wish for you to go back to the old way. So the system also goes through quite a readjustment if that paradigm shift is going to stick. And with each successive shift, less and less of the world thinks and acts like me. And so it's much more lonely and liberating, because it's like waking up from the dream. Each paradigm shift is like a good slap, maybe another metaphor.
Lucille?
Yes.
When you first talked about this regressing, and then, you know, looking at it as it's a continuous up and down. This is Susan.
Yes.
You know, one of the things I was curious about, and I felt, because I felt in this phase in part, is what may feel like regression, because this is part of what I've been asking, that context, because it's different and it feels like I've pulled back and constricted. And you and I've talked in the past here. And I'm wondering, and it's shifting and changing. And and where it feels like regressing, because viewpoints or feelings are changing, is that part of the growth, because it does feel, and it's like where it goes into that upward phase, and for what I'm looking for and what I'm reaching for, you know, like flow. So what to me may come as, ooh, this is different, and this is uncomfortable, and this is painful, and for whatever reasons feels like regression. And it's a shift in perspective for me. So is that growth? And that's part of what I've asked. Is this growth?
Yeah. So two thoughts around that. The one is that most real growth is deeply uncomfortable and painful. So a lot of regression is to get back to being comfortable, to get back to a stage where it's not as hard work, where I don't have to respond to as many variables and subtleties and nuances and feelings and people. So regression is often a hunkering, or it's not even conscious, but it's like, I'm going to a place where I think I'll be safer and it will be less painful. Whereas a lot of real growth is actually quite painful. It's like that shattering, that rearrangement. In many ways. And so regression can also cause pain, because maybe it brings conflict back that had been gone. You know, it's a complex story. So I don't know. And it's a good question to ask. One of the things that I have heard said by one of my teachers, Uranio, that I might share that's useful into this context is there are four kinds of shifts in our lives. The one kind of shift is the shift where we are shifting and we know it, and God knows it too. Then there's the place where we're not shifting, and God knows that too. We're stuck and God knows that. Then there's the place where we're stuck, we're not shifting, and we don't know it, and God doesn't know it, no one knows it. But then there's the very problematic place where we are growing and we're transforming, but God doesn't know it, because there's nothing that's visible to the outside world, or, you know, it's all imagined in some kind of way. So goodness knows what kind of shift you're going through, Susan. Is it a form of painful stuckness? Is it a regression? Is it a growth? Only time will tell. When we talk about vertical development, we have to stretch our time frame to be longitudinal, because any event-based view is going to give us a very limited picture. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about a particular part of the shift that's called the long dark night of the soul. On the Enneagram, it's the space between 4 and 5. That's a place where it's particularly hard to see what's happening and to have energy to go anywhere or do anything or make sense of it. So let's maybe make more sense of that after tea. So yeah, Renata, shall we be back at 10 to the hour? Is that good?
Yeah, perfect. That's great.
Right.
See you all in a bit. Mute yourselves before
You're going to speak to spiritual bypassing, aren't you? Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.
Lynn always has great questions. Don't you, Lynn?
I'm very curious.
Lynn's studying with Richard Rohr, a 2-year program. She's in her second
wonderful.
year.
Okay. So inviting everyone back into the space. And yeah, Renata, anything that we need to say? I realized when everyone was in breakout rooms that I possibly misinterpreted the invite that said 2 to 5, and that actually it's a 2 to 4:30 group today. So what I want to suggest is that maybe I'd love to do some of the teaching side until just close to 4:30, and then those that want to stay for some Q&A and can stay for some Q&A afterwards can do that until 5 o'clock. Would that be okay? Because I think...
And just to say, it wasn't your misinterpretation. It was me who typed to 4:30 but sent the calendar invite until 5. So just to keep things interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So any burning questions before we go a little bit deeper and bring it even closer to the Enneagram? I don't see.
I think
any
let's go ahead. We're all going to hear the teaching, Lucille.
Okay, great. So I will just to consolidate some of what we've spoken to about now, up until now, with just 1 or 2 maybe additional concepts thrown in. So when we talk about vertical development, these are some of the concepts that we have to grapple with. The first is the idea of stage fluidity and center of gravity. So center of gravity would be the room in the house that you live in most of the time, right? So this is where the stage of maturity, where I spend most of my time in my current phase of my life. And then the idea of fluidity would be, in a day, I might go down all the way to the basement to some of my earliest stage of development behavior and go all instinct and fixated behavior in some kind of way, be very unhealthy. And I might have some moments where I'm actually accessing a higher stage than my center of gravity. So that idea of living across multiple levels of the house is the fluidity. But the room I live in most of the time at this stage of my life is called my center of gravity. Elasticity is something that relates to Lynn's earlier question of spiritual bypass, maybe in some way. Elasticity is the particular capacity that some people have for transcendent spiritual experiences. Now, some people find it more accessible to actually have that experience. Maybe I'm not living in that room yet, but to access higher states of consciousness. And that capacity to easily do it is what we call elasticity. Some people really struggle. We kind of plod in our current stage and our current level of consciousness, and we find it hard to transcend it. It can even be a form of stuckness. Now, the interesting thing is that sometimes people who are very elastic, so they jump into much higher states of consciousness easily, find it really hard to make an actual stage jump, to live in the next room in the house, because I've got this, oh, I can just go there and it can be nice, and then I can just go back to being asleep almost, extreme. Whereas sometimes people that plod and that don't necessarily have easy access to higher states of consciousness. They do the hard work to open the door to the next stage of consciousness, and sometimes that sticks better. So elasticity is a concept that's quite interesting to work with. And then stuckness is when no matter what I do, I can't seem to get out of this paradigm that I'm in. Now, there are many different reasons for stuckness. The first thing to just say is that it is healthy for us to spend a number of years, and on average, we spend between 7 to 10 years in a certain stage of maturity before we make a proper paradigm shift. It's not something that, 2020 I was here, and 2021 I'm here, and 2022 I'm there. It doesn't work like that. We spend time in a phase. So sometimes I'm stuck because I'm still doing the work of that phase. But sometimes people are stuck in a certain stage because of context. And sometimes it's also because of personal experiences. Trauma, for example, can keep us very stuck. So unprocessed trauma from earlier stages of life can mean that it feels too dangerous for me to open myself to a change in paradigm. And so that keeps me safe in some kind of way. And might be actually quite a healthy positioning. I would also just caution against a very Western neoliberal paradigm. The neoliberal paradigm makes the individual responsible for everything. So if you're stuck, it's your fault. And that's only half of the story. Context is also something that can, that does play into our lives. It's not all like self-help books. You just haven't imagined it well enough, and that's why it's not happening for you. Context is real, people. So just make sure that in your own thinking of your own processing that you don't whip yourself too much, and you don't whip your clients overly, because some things, yes, they are definitely because of us and we haven't done the work, but some things are contextual as well. If you're more interested in reading more about fallback, look at the work of Valerie Livesay. She has a wonderful website. On my website, there's a couple of talks that she's done for us. She's in the US, and you can also read some of her articles and her PhD work on fallback, and some other language that's useful. What are you stretching into? So regression, progression, fallback, stretch into. So those are just terms that I find really useful in working with clients on things. Yeah, any quick questions there? Oh, I see people are putting some things in there. Thank you. I think the next slide, which is around spirituality and psychology, I want to touch on very briefly because this is a rabbit hole. But Lynn, you and I started this conversation a little bit. And for me, when we talk about these things, I do want to make it clear that I come from a perspective of believing that the synthesis rather than the two opposites are what's really useful here. But I think in the Enneagram world, a lot of our Enneagram thinking about vertical development is overtly and sometimes exclusively spiritual. And that there's more of a need to bring it into conversation with sound psychological theories and sound psychological practices. So when we talk about what spirituality would say would help us with vertical development, it would say, follow your spiritual practices. If you meditate, if you do mindfulness practices, if you're busy with contemplation, if you're studying certain sacred teachings or sacred texts, do that. Follow your path, be devoted to your path, have a community that you practice in, all of these really useful. And then, of course, inside spirituality, there's a lot of thoughts around elevated states of consciousness through my relationship or communion with God or oneness or whatever my language is for that. And of course, if you have shamanic practices, it's not just transcendence, but descendance as well. It's not just spirit, but soul as well. But that's a whole different conversation as well. The question that I would ask to help us think about some of the pitfalls here is, am I holding a story that my spirituality is supposed to just make life better and better and easier and easier? Because if that's my perspective, I run the risk of the spiritual bypass. And the spiritual bypass is wanting to experience the elevated states and the transcendence without doing the hard work of being in the pain that actually allows those things to have meaning and substance and to stick. So spiritual practices by themselves can lead to head in the sky. I am particularly cautious about our relationships with gurus or teachers or spiritual leaders. In the absence of our psychological work, we are not always aware of the transference and countertransference and even sexual attraction that happens in the relationship with the guru teacher. And the psychological helps me to make sense of some of those things that I experience when I am in a relationship with someone who is further along in the path than I am. That being said, working with someone who's further along on the path than I am is incredibly helpful for my vertical development journey. So there's nothing wrong with it, but I can get into trouble if I'm not making psychological sense of some of the feelings that happen in that relationship with a guru or teacher. On the psychological side, if I only do psychological work in the absence of the spiritual, I might be very devoted to my therapeutic practices. I might be very adept at processing the past. There might be quite a thought of what's scientific, what does the theory say, what's the mind space, not so much as the elevated states that I'm interested in. And I'm there to elevate my sense making rather than to elevate the state of consciousness I'm in, which is a kind of mind version of elevation. If I'm only doing the psychological work, one of the questions that I might ask myself is it really true that it's only supposed to get harder and harder as we mature and grow? Because some of the existential philosophers and existential psychotherapists would, for example, tell you that life becomes more and more miserable and then you die. And if you can just stay asleep, you'll actually be happier. And is that a full picture? Because that's also a binary picture. Instead of transcendence, I'm interested in narrative. And then I see I've got a typo here. It's feet on the ground, head in the sky is spiritual. I'll change that before I send this out. The risk in psychological work by and of itself is the risk of self-absorption. It's a narcissistic trap in some way. And of course there, I might have a lot of sense of authority in the therapist, but at least here, I have practices of supervision, making sure that I understand transference and countertransference. Processing sexual attraction is between clients and therapists is often something you take to supervision as well. So there's some interesting practices there, that kind of balance things. So I do believe that an integration and a holistic perspective on vertical development of bringing spiritual and psychological together is what's most helpful for us. I do know in the Enneagram community, a lot of our writing is about the spiritual only. And that's where I just caution that we bring sound psychological theory into relationship with it. And I'm hoping to share some thoughts and ideas on how that works. So now, kind of bringing us back into the Enneagram of Personality, which all of us here on the call are quite interested in. If I had to, in some way, synthesize some of the stories around what vertical development looks like, that you would get from many of the teachers and practices of the Enneagram, this is maybe part of the story, what it looks like, and you can look at Sandra Maitri's work or Russ's work, or there's lots of versions of what we could work with here. So the first thing is there is the sense, and if you read the wisdom of the Enneagram, they're the 9 levels of awareness that Russ would speak of, and Ginger would, for example, have 3 levels in there, and different people, different stories. But in some of our Enneagram work, we do talk about different stages in the awareness or vertical development process. Yeah. But if we really think about what's the story that the Enneagram of Personality tells us about what enables that vertical development, I think the first thing is that there is this distinction that is made that says there's limited awareness, that comes from personality and our relationship with our ego and everything that happens for us through object relations and our past and what we're born into. And then there's that's the below the line stuff. And then there's the above the line stuff, which is essence or expanded awareness. Now, only some parts of psychology would even hold sway with the idea of the concept of essence as being something that exists. So if you haven't come across writings that challenges the idea of an essential nature, read some of the existential therapists and existential philosophy work around, does essence really exist? So that's just an aside maybe. But then within that, there are different parts of this journey. The first is that there is below the line, our distorted instincts. So this is when we become slaves to our instincts. We have an instinct that's taking a lot of our energy in a possibly unconscious way. Our instincts are driving a lot of our behavior. We don't even know it. Some instincts are strong, it's stacked, you know, all of that. Above the line, we have what we call the undistorted instincts, and they are the ones that are part of our essential nature. We have access to all of them in a healthy way, and they move through us in response to context in an appropriate way. And we are conscious of our relationship with our instincts. And they have a healthy and useful role to play, but in a very different way to when we're in our asleep state. The second part of the journey has to do with the relationship between the lower emotional center and the higher emotional center. And some people talk about this as the vice to virtue conversion, and really coming to grips with, in the lower emotional center, our passions drive a lot of our behaviors. We start becoming aware of them at some point. And we really have to understand what that means. If my lower emotional center is in charge, I struggle to, or only momentarily can make sense of what, for example, pride means for me as an Enneagram 2. And I have a big story of how it's not pride, it's something else, or I'm offended even by the word pride. That's lower emotional center. The passion is driving the behavior and I'm struggling to bring it into consciousness. In my expanded awareness, not only can I see the pride, but I can also work with the virtue of the type as it is represented and start expressing more of that and less of the passion. And it's through really conscious work that that happens. And then, of course, the third part would be to do with the mental center, from the fixations, which are also maybe not understood as well. And I think Ingrid, you've run some sessions here around really understand the fixations, or I've seen it somewhere on the list. It's really important for us as teachers to not gloss over just what the fixations mean. And it's this is where the holy ideas become hard, though, because in order for us to understand the holy ideas from where most of us live our lives, we need some elasticity. We need to be able to make sense, maybe for a moment, what that holy idea means, because otherwise the idea of holy origin is just like a whole lot of words, or holy perfection. And it's like, I need some elasticity and some work, and spiritual work actually helps me to make sense of some of those holy ideas, but otherwise they very hard to grapple with. And I don't think we work enough with the lower and the higher mental center in the way in which most of us work with the Enneagram at the moment. We need to work more with some of those ideas. So that gives you an idea of what the general story would be if you read lots and lots and you go to many, many workshops. This is, I think, what we're trying to say from more of a spiritual perspective, what enables vertical development. Let me just see here. I now want to put it on the process map. Yeah. So, and this is, I'll give you two ways of putting things on the process map. This is bringing the spiritual view onto the process map, and then I'm going to bring a psychological view onto the process map as well, just to mess with you a little bit further. So if we tell the story on the process map. So now, once again, remember, 1 doesn't mean the perfectionist or the reformer. 2 doesn't mean the helper. We're talking about those steps in a process journey. So here we are as human beings. We are pre-conception. We one with universe, with God, with whatever your language is. We're in oneness. We are born into this world. And in the first couple of years, months, years of life, we lose that undifferentiated sense of oneness. And we start figuring out that I'm actually separate from my mother, and that I'm a distinct human being in the world. And here I am now. You know, our sense of oneness in early years of our life is kind of pre-awareness version of that. Now, what then happens in the first stage of our development is, and we've plotted this, so we're plotting things on the hexad now, just so you see the different stages, is my instincts and my Enneagram subtype is in charge, and I am asleep. Yeah. So I am part of those of us who walk through life in the trance. I'm in the trance. Yeah. I think Dirk used that earlier in the what's the Enneagram about, waking us up from trance. So I'm in my trance, instincts and subtypes are in charge. Now, through experiences, through work, I might start to wake up. And in that process of waking up, the next stage of the journey is mostly spent in my lower mental and lower emotional centers. So my fixations and the passions of my type are in charge here, but my instincts I'm at least a little bit more conscious of. And what then happens is, as I start grappling with the fixations and the passions, and I start, so what happens in this phase is I actually have to expand my identity into understanding how I am not just like the description of my type. Yeah. So I am not just as an Enneagram 2 incredibly helpful. I can be incredibly selfish and separate and unkind too. And I need to start seeing these two almost opposites, and there are many opposites, right? But I need to loosen my relationship with the description of my type and elevate the amount of tension that is in the opposites. Because through that process, a synthesis into a more expanded identity can take place. I'm using some psychological terms now, I realize, and I'm maybe a bit ahead of myself. But part of the process is to spiritually make the tension about the disaffirming parts of yourself bigger and bigger and bigger, so that a new possibility can be born. Russ has this sweet little hand thing that he always does. He says, there's the one side and then there's the other side. And then if you can be in the tension between those two enough, then the third possibility gets born. And that gives birth to another one side and another side, and then the synthesis. So thesis, antithesis, synthesis is the overall spiritual growth process that we're in over time. So I'm doing all of that. And when I'm in this phase, quite interesting. So when I'm in this phase, I'm like, I'm just my type. Don't bother me. I am who I am, and don't get in the way of what I want in life. The rest of you need to develop, right? In this phase, I'm starting to grapple with how I can adapt myself. I'm becoming aware a little bit more. I'm trying to see my passions. I'm trying to see my fixations. I'm working with it. And sometimes here, as I start getting ready for the next step in the journey, I start wondering whether I'm actually my type. Am I sure I'm, a 7? Maybe I'm a 6. They say 7s are always optimistic, and I'm quite, pessimistic and depressed about life right now. Are you sure I'm a 7? Maybe I'm not a 7. And I'm going through this. So that's really healthy. We should have more of those conversations with our clients rather than trying to shut them down, because it's not very Our jobs are to expand the identities of our clients, not to make them smaller. So any contradictory information is much more useful than, oh, here's another conversation about how optimistic I am as a 7. Really, and go find someone else to work with if that's the conversation you want to have. No, sorry. We'll talk about disrupt and contain a little bit later, but that's my favorite move. So then if we continue to grow, here at Enneagram 3, remember earlier we said it's not a step in the journey, but it's where the external world whacks us normally. And it's the gaping mouth. There's the opportunity for context and external things to cause an additional layer of disruption in different ways. Now, shock points can be positive or negative, but in some way the external world is challenging me. And so I might be going on this wonderful spiritual growth journey. And then all of a sudden, my partner says, you're not the person I married, and I don't want to be in relationship with you. And my job says, you've become a lot less effective. You don't seem to care so much about the performance management system anymore. You're getting fired in the restructuring. And that's a shock point. Yeah. Or all of a sudden, Corona happens and I can't be out in the world and do my work. And, you know, I'm sitting at home. There's many ways in which the shock point can happen. If I continue on my work, I'm now getting into the space of having more and more access to the higher emotional center. And so this would be the place where I'm in the vice to virtue conversion. And I'm able to start making decisions more regularly from the virtue of my type as opposed to the passion of my type. In the higher emotional center, I'm really for the first time starting to get a real sense of what words like gratitude and love and care and community really mean. Up to now, there are versions of that are more conventional expressions, but feeling and living that from the inside starts becoming available to me in the higher emotional center. So now you see, we're continuing on this little journey, but we're in this weird space between 4 and 5, the place where the hexa doesn't touch directly, and it's the opening in the Enneagram. It's very deliberate that 9 is at the top of the Enneagram. It's the beginning and the end point of all processes and journeys. But it's also very important to notice this part here at the bottom. And it represents the dark night of the soul. If I continue with my development journey, I get lost. And the dark night of the soul is really the place where I can't make sense of anything anymore. I don't have energy for the things I used to have energy for. I am lost. And I can be lost there for a long, long time. In the normal course of a life, if you use some of the anthroposophical ideas on 7-year cycles in life, this would sit in your midlife crisis. But we all develop in different stages and get stuck at different points. But through the dark night of the soul, I normally can't get out of the dark night of the soul of my own volition. I only get access to the higher mental center as a center of gravity through the divine intervention from shock point 6. And shock point 6 is often the intervention that comes from a spiritual guide. In the Sufi tradition, it's the place where the gravitational pull of the Sufi dancing pulls me into a higher elevated mental consciousness. And to live here as a center of gravity is incredibly hard, and very few people do that. And to go beyond this, shock point 6 into 7 and 8, we would be talking of the living saints. Yeah. Now, most Enneagram teachers would say that roughly 90 to 95% of people are still living in the first stage and are in the trance. And for some of us, you know, even, and it's a beautiful question to ask yourself. So even if you feel you have access to your higher emotional center, At the end of the day, it's a Gurdjieffian practice. When you lie in bed, ask yourself, how many hours of my waking life did I express the higher emotional center into the world and my way of being, as opposed to the bits where I was driving around half asleep and the bits where I was actually quite rude and awful. And you'll get the sense that being in a center of gravity that's beyond this shock point at Enneagram 3 is actually bloody hard and takes a tremendous amount of work. And here maybe comes one of my criticisms of just seeing things in a spiritual sense. If we're putting 95% of people in this box here, that doesn't give me sufficient of a roadmap of how to help people to just move this part of the journey. And that's where psychology becomes incredibly helpful. And where, from a constructivist development theory perspective, there's a lot more of a granularity on what this part of the journey looks like that comes from psychology. And the Enneagram community is slightly loath to bring some of it in. I mean, there's a couple of people who have started to bring it in different ways. But we need to think about what psychology can teach us about this part of the journey. Because just saying 95% of people are in a trance isn't giving me a sense of how to help people wake up. And so I have to, I have to take my drawing away. So maybe this is the last part of the sharing that I'd like to do today, just before we go for question and answer. So the work that I'm going to represent here is mostly from a constructivist development theory perspective. There are many different words for these steps. Some of you that know spiral dynamics may know some of it. Some of you that know Cook-Greuter's work, or Torbert's work, or Terry O'Fallon's work. I mean, there's a whole list, can see some of it. Some of you that work in developmental coaching might understand and see the references to Keegan's work that Jennifer Garvey-Berger works with quite a lot. But this is the map that we work with, having brought together some of those constructivist development theory ideas with existential philosophy and existential psychotherapy in our practice at Aephoria. And so I'm now going to maybe be slightly sacrilegious and say, if we think of this journey on the circle as the life, maybe this circle that I'm representing here actually fits into the space between 9, 1, 2, and before the shock point 3 in the map that we looked at previously. But it gives us a lot more granularity, and it also helps us make sense of some of the shifts. I believe that each of these points on the Enneagram, 1, 2, 3, and 6 are still our major shock points. But each of these points represent an opportunity where the external world and our context can help us make a paradigm shift. Yeah? Constructivist development theory would say that these are, and it's an invariant stage model. So you have to go through all the stages in sequence. You can't skip some of them. You can do some of them quite badly, and then you probably have to go back and do more work there later. But you can't go from this stage to that stage. You have to go around the circle. This is how it works. And so to just talk you very briefly through these stages of waking up. The first stage is very similar to our instincts are in charge stage. It's called the self-protecting phase. And this is the phase where my instincts drive me. Whatever I want is what I want. I don't get in my way. If I want to have the marshmallow now, referencing the marshmallow experiment, I'll have the marshmallow now. But that might also mean if I want to be in front of you in the queue while shopping, I will push you out of the way. If I want to have sex with you, I will have sex with you. If I want to, so if I want to stay away from work because I want to watch my favorite football team play over the weekend, I will, and I don't care if I get fired because that's really what I want right now. That's the self-protecting phase. What normally helps me out of the self-protecting phase, so here, the second phase in between these shock points is what we call the conforming phase. The conforming phase is where somehow I've realized that it's not cool to just want what I want all the time. I actually don't get to keep a lot of friends and family happy around me. So the conforming phase, I kind of merge with the group and I say, you know, if I'm, well, you can use any kind of group here, but if I'm a white Afrikaans Christian girl, and that's what I've grown up in, then I'm going to be the best exemplar of a good white Afrikaans Christian girl. And I'm going to play according to the rules of my group, and other groups are bad. So the non-Christian groups are bad, or even men are bad, or, you know, people of color are bad. There are many ways I can make other people bad because I'm overly identified. I'm conforming with an identity, which is not even my identity. It's an external identity that I'm over-identifying with. So there's a phase where I'm here. So if people are here for a long time, normally they start figuring out that in some ways I don't really agree with the way the group thinks. And there's some facts out there, and maybe I get to become good at something. And I realize, you know, as a scientist, it's not really cool for me to think of only these religious ideas. Maybe I need to think of it in a different way. So the specializing phase, which is much more rational and scientific and quantitative in the world. Normally, a big shock point in between specializing and performing, where I figure out that it's not just what you do and what you know, but also how you do it. That's important. So all of a sudden I start becoming interested in culture and participation and a whole lot of things like that. But I'm still in the conventional world. This half of the Enneagram represents the conventional world. I'm kind of drinking the Kool-Aid. You know, I'm being a good manager or a good employee or a good family member, and I'm playing according to the rules. And I believe the stuff you read in self-help books, and I think the 10 laws of success are great. And, you know, there are different things in here. Here, a different variation of the dark night of the soul is the process where I stop drinking the Kool-Aid and I'm saying, wow, actually all of this doesn't make me happy. I've been a good employee for 20 years and I feel a lack of meaning in my life. And I'm not sure I can do this for another 20 years. And maybe I want to grow garlic and move to the Karoo or whatever. It's a very Afrikaans metaphor, but bear with me. And then this part of the journey becomes the post-conventional, less in the game, less in the world, and beyond the conventions into my own version of my own life. The internalizing phase has to do with balancing my life through processing. It's a very psychological phase, processing all the things I haven't processed and felt up to now. This is normally a phase where, for example, Enneagram 9s get terribly angry. You know that story, like 9s aren't angry? I've lived with a 9 in an internalizing phase. They're angry at bloody everything, like everything that I've kept at bay. So if as a 3, I've always worked really hard and I've never stopped. Sometimes this is the phase where life just stops me. Yeah. So the internalizing phase, all of the things that I've kept at bay start being processed and coming to the fore. And that then creates that polarization that we spoke about earlier between my supposed identity as the Enneagram describes me and the fact that only sometimes, and the rest of the time, maybe it's very different, which is part of the shock point that then enables me to get to a phase called strategizing. This is a place fairly high up on the mountain where I'm starting to see a systems view. And beyond that, the place where I'm not so much interested in managing the system, but interested in being the difference that I make in the world. It's not about what I do that makes the difference, but who I am. And this then starts getting us into the point, which is represented by the higher heart center. So this is a mini map inside a map that comes from psychology. There's a lot more to say about this. And I guess the last thing that I would want to do before we go to Q&A for those of you that can stay is just to share from a psychological perspective what, okay, 3 thoughts. I forgot about this one. If you want to psychologically support people to move vertically. Your job as a coach or a therapist or whatever work you do is to get the balance right in the dance between disrupting and containing. So disrupt, shatter the frame, and then help pull it back together, make it safe again. If you're in a place where you're not challenging your clients, you're going to just help them be more stuck in the phase that they're in. Now, that story of disrupt and contain, when people are in these very early phases of maturity, you have to be quite gentle with your disruption. Otherwise, they reject you wholeheartedly. So maybe some of you have had that experience where you say, oh, you're a sexual too. Do you know that your subtype's called seduction? And then people say, I never want to work with you again. I don't want to be part of this process. This is bad. And it's just too much, because they're very early on in their phase of maturity. They can't handle that. Seduction is too much of a disruption. Yeah. When you get to people that are in these phases, you have to work very hard. You have to rattle them. Your disruption must be slappy, because they are already psychologically robust enough to handle that kind of disruption. And they need that kind of disruption because the rest of the conventional world are pandering to them anyway. So your job is to be more disruptive there. But as much as you disrupt, you also then need to contain in similar ways. Second thought, so that's the gentle and tough do you work. And then the third thing is, how do we measure it? Now, the first thing is, it is very tricky to measure vertical development. The one thing you cannot rely on, unless people are already incredibly self-aware, and even then you have to be skeptical, is self-report. I cannot tell you how evolved I am, because my faking good is just going to be off the scale. So there are three ways in psychology that we know to measure it. The first is what we call sentence completion. So we've developed the sentence completion test. It's very qualitative. It's kind of a projective. So we're talking projective mechanisms. Sentence completion is the one you use most, but you can also use Rorschach's or TITs or CATs or whatever. There's a lot of projective techniques you can use here. The second is what we call a subject-object interview, which is a specific area of expertise. It's different to a narrative typing interview, and it takes about 2.5 to 4 hours to do. And then you can get a slight measure of it through 360, but 360s can only tell you the external picture. It doesn't give you so much internal information around it. Last slide, then Q&A. If you want to design for vertical development, either in your one-on-one work or in group work or in your own life, you can think about the what, the who, and the how to help you think about it. So, and you need to know that whatever you do on the body side will repattern your mind. But you can hear the psychological terminology here. Repattern your mind, that's psychological version of it. But see this alongside some spiritual practices, right? So the heat experiences, what is it that I can do? The first thing is go work for a leader that's going to throw you into the deep end in your corporate life. Yeah. Work with someone who gets you to do stuff that you don't think you can do. You can also then help people take developmental risks. And in coaching, this happens all the time. People say, this and this and this happens, and I'm too scared to have the conversation. If you can help people take developmental risks and help them do that soundly, that's it. You can work with your immunity to change. You can manufacture heat in a workshop setting. Ingrid already referred to some of my crazy design ideas, but a lot of that's about manufacturing heat. Getting really type A people to potter around for 3 hours. I mean, the amount of heat you have at the end of three hours of that, you can do anything you want with them. And then as a leader or as a coach, you know, the thing is, people learn by being out of their comfort zone. So if you give assignments to the least rather than the best qualified person, who's going to learn from it? The person who already knows how to do things won't learn much from it. They'll just do the job. So this is from a developmental perspective, give assignments to people who are unqualified to do it and then walk the journey with them. The second part on colliding perspectives, so from a leadership perspective, you need to create frame-breaking experiences. So, you know, whether it's a day in your customer's rice paddy or going and being inside going and doing the least qualified person's job. I mean, there's even TV shows about this, but that's an idea. Working with systems perspectives, actively stepping into other people's worldviews. Really, so if you're American and you are a Democrat, there's some amazing people who've done work going and really trying to step into a Republican worldview. And there's some sociologists that have done some amazing work around this and moved from San Francisco to, you know, kind of the heartland of South Carolina, and they've never been the same again. That's a way to mature. You can work with polarity thinking. That's a really good way of doing it. And of course, peer coaching, where you get challenged by people with very different views, helpful. And then the last one, elevated sense making, is how you do that. Go and learn from people who use some of these stage maps, learn how to coach with a vertical lens, have a coach or a supervisor or a mentor who is more mature than you. If you are seeing a therapist or a coach or a supervisor that's less mature than you, you're wasting your time. You need to work with someone who confuses, confounds, and challenges you rather than says all the things that makes you feel good about yourself. That's normally a great way to know if you're working with someone that's more mature than you. Someone infuriating. One of the people that I supervise at the moment, I know that we've had a good session where somewhere in the session he says, oh, just fuck off. Then I know we've processed what really happened between him and his client very well. We want to go for that. And then obviously, you know, building and designing vertical development experiences and doing mindfulness practices. And that's where some of the spirituality work can help me to actually elevate my sense making. So those are some of the ideas of how to do these things. Now, I've said too much for too long. So I want to just open for those of you that can stay for the next 25 minutes, just Q&A, comments, your conversations. I'll mostly shut up now. But hopefully that gives you some sense of different ways to use the Enneagram. So let's just hear. You can just unmute yourself if you have questions or comments, anything welcome.
And feel free just to type questions in the chat as well. So Lucille might pick and choose some of the questions that she feels might be of more value. If anybody does need to go, just be aware that Lucille's very kindly and with great generosity offered to make her slides available. So we'll send the slides and the recording out afterwards to all of you. So just in case you can't stay, you'll be able to hear the Q&A. So yeah, type your questions in the chat. Yes, you are getting the slides.
Yeah. So we'd love to hear where people's thoughts are at.
Lucille, do you mind if I jump in with a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
While everybody's typing. So in the psychological phases where we move from self-protecting, conforming, performing, internalizing, right? So after 3 shock point, is this where the one that I wanted to ask about? No. Yes. So in the performing between 3 and 4, in fact, it was the one before that, between 3 and 4, that's the higher emotional state, and between 5 and 6, we're moving into higher mental. But then when you were talking about moving from internalizing shock point 6, strategizing, transforming to that phase of being, somewhere along there you said this is where we start to get into the higher heart or something, or?
Yeah, so I'm just going to put a slide on to just explain this maybe again, because it will make more sense this time around. So all of these phases that are on this slide actually fit into this spiritual framework in between here and here. So I've taken this part of the journey and given it more granularity by connecting it to the psychological stages from constructivist development theory. So this stage of being, which is here between 8 and 9, is actually something that actually fits still on this side of the map here. Now, there are very few people, less than 1% of the world lives in lives according to this Enneagram stages of development map, lives on this side of the dark night of the soul. Less than 1%. And 90 to 95% of us still live here. So in breaking down the phases between instincts and higher emotional center, it helps us get people on the little steps on the journey a little bit easier. Does that make sense now, Renata?
No, I still don't get how, if we're getting to the heart in being, because we're getting to the heart here.
Okay. It's a fractal, right?
Okay.
So sorry, undo, clear all drawings. So this entire map, the psychological map, the stage map that I showed here, doesn't want to go there. This entire map, self-protecting to being, fits into the one half of the Enneagram. Here I've taken it all around, but it only actually fits between 1 and 4 on this map.
Okay, now it makes sense. And so just in terms of, so, I mean, would I then equate high emotional center to having more frequent experiences of the virtue, if I'm going to bring this into Enneagram language, and then on the other side, the internalizing, where we get into the higher head center,
the holy idea. Not just, so it's living it. It's being, it's living the virtue, living the holy idea, which is very different. So it's the difference between knowing and knowing. Knowing is just in the head. For those of you that don't understand Afrikaans, knowing is like, it's something you do with your hands, and it's like you're living it. It's in your body. It's where you spend your life. So that's the distinction between when we're just having an elastic experience of the holy idea, and when we are a representation in our lives of the holy idea. And for all of us, we know, even, so for me, I'm very seldom an expression in my life of the holy idea of my type. In fact, my family would laugh out loud if I even suggested that I have any idea of holy origin.
Yeah. So it just, so then this is the last, I don't want to, in fact, no, never mind. Somebody else, let's do somebody else's question. I want to hog the question.
So I have a question, and I know I'm not hogging the question thing, but is it more accessible to access the higher emotional state over the higher
the holy idea? Yeah, absolutely. The virtue is more accessible than the holy idea of the type. The holy idea. So I can mentally make sense. Let's just work with holy perfection, right? So the holy idea of Enneagram 1, which you can use lots of very special words, but the basic part of that is to say that the world is perfect in its brokenness.
Right.
Now, for me to really live my life in a state of grace and in right relationship with the idea that it is holy, not in spite of being broken, but because it is broken, is actually, sorry, I'm going to use rude words, everyone. I have 8 in my tri-type. It's a mind fuck. It's really, really, really hard to live my life as if I believe that, because there's something inherent in me that still wants to fix everything, that notices the imperfection and is drawn towards wanting to make that right. So speaking from an Enneagram One perspective. So for me, the idea that I am in a state of grace in relation to the world that is perfect because it is broken. It's very, very difficult. Very, very, very difficult.
And are there particular practices to really cultivate that? I mean, I'm just thinking on the 8 point, you know, to be soft and open emotionally, to be unprotected, and to be and to be unprotected and safe. It seems.
So those things are all going to help you be in relationship with the virtue of innocence.
Exactly. But
and
then
through being innocent and bringing that together with an incredibly deep devotion to a spiritual path and right relationship with my spiritual guides and deeply devoted to my path over time, by living the life from innocence rather than from lust, that idea will become more available. So there's all the practices that help me to be in relationship with the virtue of innocence allow me to then cultivate a state of being that will be open to receiving. But most of the holy ideas come to us as downloads.
Right.
Really, really embodying it comes to us as downloads as opposed to through practice. But our devotion and being in the virtue of our type is often the best we can hope for. If we're not very elastic, we might take 10 years to get the first bit of the download. I don't know.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you.
And obviously, if you're doing a 2-year course with Father Richard, a lot of the practices that you teach there will help you move towards more of a state of being inside that 0.4 on the process map. And from there, you can hear the whisperings of 0.5. Whereas, you know, without that, it's much harder to be in a place where I will be able to even hear across the void that sits between 4 and 5.
Thank you.
A couple of us have asked in the chat if you could comment on your charts how spiral dynamics and/or Laloux's reinventing organizations, you know, sort of the color-coded version of those models, which is easier to talk about, I think.
Yeah.
Where you see that, and I'm curious if you see the 4 to 5 gap as sort of the momentous leap. Is that what I'm?
Yeah.
You know, but,
absolutely. Yeah. That's a very good. So, I mean, there's some small differences between the Greeff's work and some of the constructivist development theories. One of the stages is the other way around, basically. But a lot of the other things map very beautifully. The problem that I have, so this is just a slight problem with spiral dynamics, is that this idea that the stages just keep opening up, and then we've got turquoise, and then we've got iridescent white, and I don't know, soon we're going to be in a color spectrum that doesn't even exist yet. That idea is actually something that comes from an individualistic competitive culture that starts to invent more stages than there actually are, just to keep the teachers happy that they're better than everyone else.
Exactly.
Sorry, that was quite rude. But the original, before we started adding those levels, the original spiral dynamic Greeff's, the Greff stages are very useful. The problem that you have then with measurements of the Greeff's work is if you get back to self-report, you get back to idealistic notions of my own development. And so having done some correlations between, for example, sentence completion and self-report on stages on Claire Graves's work, generally you take the self-report and you go 2 levels down. And that would be the more objective measures. Okay, objective is a problematic word, but that's another rabbit hole. But those qualitative measures would take you 2 stages back from self-report. In Enneagram terms, there's something different that happens. So if you just use a Riso Hudson 9-stage model, if you have good self-awareness, you can generally through descriptions pinpoint where you are in that model. You may need some psychological support for the spiritual idea of development rather than just going on a spiritual path to develop yourself. But if you're doing kind of a self-report questionnaire that tries to plot you on stages of development on Russ's levels, the weird thing that happens is that people that become self-aware and that then starts having that I'm an Enneagram 9, but I'm angry, am I really an Enneagram 9 perspective, will often self-report at lower stages of development because of their self-awareness, as opposed to people who are in the trance and think they're great. Sorry, I almost swore again. So the narcissism of the trance can self-report in a problematic way.
Mary has a question. Go ahead, Mary.
Before I say anything, I'm only too aware of how easy it is to get into spiritual bypass. So I'm not coming from that place. I really don't think. But I have a question to ask you about that 4-5 gap. Having gone through the dark side of the soul, I find it's the place of my greatest creativity. By the way, I'm a 5-9-4. That's my type. So I have to straddle 4 and 5 all the time anyway. But I find that blankness, that void, that emptiness, that not having anything or knowing anything, that place is for me the most creative place to be, because from that place, creation emerges, stuff happens, awareness happens. So for me, where I am right now, it's about like having daily meditations. I mean, I meditate, but I'm talking about a daily contemplation on the nothing space, the blank, nothing, void place, and feeling myself attracting into that, whatever wants to emerge. And I've been working with that for the last several months. Not that I'm great at it, but it's something that is my spiritual focus at the moment. Can you just say something more about that?
Yeah.
Because I really trust your your perspective.
I think meditative practices that focus on the void are, and I know there are other people that are mindfulness practitioners here and may have something to say as well, and I welcome your input on that. But meditations that help us to access the void require a very intimate relationship with our anxiety, because it confronts us with the possibility of losing our identities.
Yeah.
And so it is an incredibly helpful practice, and it's a very scary practice as well. And it's one that's very hard to it's hard to develop adeptness at that, because the void itself is the nothing. It's much easier to sprinkle some chocolate sprinkles on top of the void to have something again. And so I think it's an incredibly useful practice, because that is the way in which we can use spiritual practice to help us develop a relationship with one of the hardest places to be on the map, which is the road of Persephone. It would be in the Greek mythology, the space between 4 and 5. So just keep in mind, Mary, when we talk about the Process Enneagram, the space between 4 and 5 represents something different to the 5 with the 4 wing, or the, working on the wings. And I know you know that, but it's useful for other people to just keep that in mind.
Yeah.
On the process map, 4 and 5 is very different to I'm a 5 with a 4 wing or 4 with a 5 wing, and therefore I straddle it all the time. Yeah. You can be a 4 with a 5 wing or a 5 with a 4 wing that's still in the first step of the process journey, and you have no idea what happens there in 4 with 5. Yeah. So generally, my work in the space between 4 and 5 on the process map is incredibly harsh work.
Yeah.
So even as a meditative practice, it's a place where I need to be incredibly harsh with myself to stay there, as opposed to some of the more breathe in and out and, just notice. And so really contemplating the void is incredibly hard work, and it's beautiful work, and it's worthwhile work. And
I find that I'm drawn back there all the time. It's not like I'm doing it because of some theory. I find that when I have no money or I don't know where I'm going or whatever, my way of processing the emotions automatically takes me to that void where I just stand and I say, I'm empty. I have nothing. I'm just empty. And then all of a sudden, stuff gets drawn. And I don't know exactly what's happening. I think it's just because I'm really old.
It's not just
at
that,
my
Mary.
age. Huh?
It's not just that, Mary. So that thing of suddenly something gets drawn is the help from the divine point at Enneagram 6. It is the spinning dervish.
Yes.
And that's just a representation of whatever spiritual helpers and forces you have.
Yes.
And the work that you've done. So maybe in part that would be some of the ancestors that come and support you into a space on the other side of that again. But
that's helpful. Yeah, that's helpful. For me, I go to empty blank. I'm not actually thinking ancestors, spirit guides, but they're there nonetheless. And so that's very helpful. Thank you very much for that.
So think about it. 6 is further along the path than where you are. So it's never you thinking about it.
No.
This is happening beyond your own world at that point in time. If you want to enhance the emptiness when you're in that state, Mary, what you can do is, even if you just take a picture of the Enneagram or on your mat of the Enneagram, physically put your finger on the space between 4 and 5, or go and stand on the space between 4 and 5.
I stand like that, and because 9 is my other number, it's really easy for me to put a foot on both sides and 9 ahead. Yeah, very easy. That represents very much my Enneagram tri-type. Yeah.
So what you would do in the space between 4 and 5 is take your feet off 4 and 5 and go and stand with your feet in the space, in the empty space between them. Take your hands out of 9, and you can crouch down, or you can just on the circle touch the space at the bottom of the Enneagram.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I think that's what I'm feeling inside is that empty, void. For me, the void is just so powerful. But I hear what you're saying about 6. That's helpful because I'm not praying to something else beyond myself. I'm just abiding in the void. So it comes from the 6. Okay, wow, that's helpful. That's really helpful. Because I always feel guilty that I'm not praying to something. Okay,
the cultivation of your relationship with a force that lives at 6 happens at earlier stages and at different points. It doesn't happen in the void. It happens in the other parts of your life.
Yes.
In the void, that prayer would take you out of the void.
Okay, perfect. Because perfect. Because I've done all that. I've been Christian. I've been dealing with the ancestors as a Sangoma. I've dealt with all that stuff, but I'm finding right now it's the blankness that's working for me, the void, the emptiness. Oh, that's great. Woo, this has been so helpful to me. I can't tell you.
Susan,
you're my little guru.
Be cautious of that relationship, Mary. Susan, your question, and then Inks.
Okay. Yeah, Lucille, I'm curious on a couple things. I'm feeling that probably the Vision Quest work that you do kind of really helps with that 4 and 5 space. And so I'm wondering, like, what other practices, like you said that about putting your finger on the 4 and the 5 and being in that space. And I'm wondering what else, like in nature, because I kind of go to nature and I'm looking out on it right now. And it's like, what can we do, which is probably some things you do just as a help, not knowing exactly where we are, but to help us in that space. I mean, it may be in nature, that's kind of where I go to, but what else?
Yeah, I mean, there are many things that you can do, and nature is a very useful relationship to cultivate, because it's bigger than us, and so it can reflect things back to us in many different ways. In shamanic practices, one of the things that you would do if you wanted to go into the space between 4 and 5 is some of the practicing death and self-burial processes. So there is a practice in some traditions where you actually dig a grave, put a reed in your mouth, you get buried, and you spend the night buried underground. That would be, so the practice between 4 and 5 is harsh. So it's ways of practicing your dying so that you may live. And so that's where one has to be really cautious, because sometimes if we come onto that space without a structure of sense making, just spiritually, without the psychological work, we might actually confuse that space with the need to die. And some spiritual suicides happen in that space because I have not had the psychological support that helps me make sense of what happens in that space. I think regardless of where I am in the stages of maturity, cultivating a relationship with nature is deeply useful. And where that sits on the Enneagram map, if you think of, remember I said the Enneagram is a 3-dimensional map. So if you think of the circle as a sphere, Mother Earth is in the middle of the Enneagram map beneath our feet. So even outside of being able to be in nature, if I stand in the middle of an Enneagram map, or I put my finger in the middle of the circle and I imagine myself connecting to Mother Earth, in the same way that in the ascendant, that middle point represents transcendence and the heavens above, then that's the point where I can meditate in the Enneagram if I want to do that.
Could I, if Susan's finished and you finished, could I ask a question into that or not?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's, and then Melissa, I'm aware that Melissa's had a question for a long time. So I want to give her
I've missed that.
Okay.
And then we'll spend 5 minutes and then we'll be done. And those few that need to go, I know it's on the hour, so we're grateful for you being here. Lynn and then Melissa.
Very, very quick. So in this dark space, practicing death, is it to help people to make some sense of this practically? When we experience a humiliation, when we experience our realization that we're indispensable, like a job loss, when we experience that we're not that important, life will go on without us. Yeah. If we can, can we help people to stay with that in the death experience?
Absolutely. So death represents a whole lot of endings, and in our current modern culture we're quite good at avoiding them. So there are many, in existential work we work with an understanding that all endings and death are wrapped into each other. So if I can't, so firstly practically contemplating my own death is useful, but then working with all kinds of endings, the ending of a marriage, the ending of a job, the ending of a status, the ending of a, you know, there's many endings, the endings of life as we know it because of COVID. If we can help our clients properly process that rather than just flitting through it, it's like, oh no, it's fine, really, it's just it'll be fine, to really process it, then I help. It's like a fractal into the dying experience as well. Right. And I can only live as much as I can understand that all life is just a moment in between nothing and nothing. Melissa?
Yeah, so just to follow up on the spiral dynamics question. What I think it really is about this idea of as in the US or any developed, country, capitalist country, it feels that in the narrative is that we're in orange. If you think of Frederick Laloux's work, that we're living in this orange / 3-ish, achievement oriented meritocracy kind of frame at a cultural level, at a societal level. And yet what you've said is that if 90% of folks are actually still in a trance at 1 or maybe 1 into 2, can you make sense of that for me?
Yep. So if you go into, so the map that correlates with Lalou's work is the one where I went all the way around from self-protecting to being. So there, the orange phase would be the performing phase.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where we're at. But remember, I said that what we're doing is that we're actually taking the whole map, the spiritual map, and just condensing it. So it does make sense. The performing and the orange is where many cultures are at. Just because a culture is there doesn't necessarily also mean that the individual is there. If I'm in the trance of my culture, am I awake or asleep?
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then also Lalou's sort of, actually it's also true in spiral dynamics, this idea that the leader, that the organization cannot exceed the meme, the value meme
Yes,
of the highest leader. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is absolutely true in many ways. And because the leader is the custodian of the structure of the organization. So in general, what happens is that leaders will not tolerate or create the kinds of structures. So if I have a leader at Orange and I'm trying to create a teal organization, whatever I'm able to conceive teal looks like will actually be a version of orange or maybe light green. And I won't necessarily be able to move the organization to green because I'm not there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it's
sorry for those of you that don't.
So teal becomes, if teal's like a goal that orange has, versus
So then if the leader has this ideal that I need to create a teal organization, I start the work with doing my own developmental work. And this is a long journey because I'm going to spend a couple of years in each of these phases in between orange and teal. So for those of you that aren't familiar with these terms, apologies. Just it makes sense to those that know it. Okay, so I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to hand back to you, Ingrid. I know you had a question or wanted to say something, and then we can close off. But it was wonderful from my side to spend time with all of you, and thank you so much for your time and your generosity of spirit on the Saturday. Hopefully I've messed with some of your frames sufficiently for that to qualify as some form of learning today. Thank you.
Lucille, thank you so much. Please take an opportunity. If you do a talk here, you get to punt. So if anybody, so punt whatever you have to punt. Unashamedly.
Okay, so very briefly, for any of you that are interested in the measurements we do of stages of development, feel free to pop me an email, and I'm very happy to offer you a free assessment and feedback around the sentence completion. So we use sentence completion for that. And then I have an Enneagram training coming up from the 17th to 19th of Feb in Africa, Europe time zone. And then there's another one in March for US time zones. If anyone's interested, please send me an email and I'll send you more information on that.
And you'll put your email in the chat now.
I'll put my email's on the pack as well, but I'll put it in now. And then also let me know if you want to know more about Vision Quests. Unfortunately, if you're not in South Africa, I don't know when our borders are going to be open again. But we have one in November. Maybe at that point in time, you'll be able to connect to us.
Awesome. Thanks, Lucille. And so, yeah, so we'll send the slides out. So it'll have your contact details on that information. That's awesome. Don't go, everybody. So huge thank you to Lucille. But I want to just give Ingrid an opportunity. She's got some amazing courses coming up. So Ing, just show your slide and tell everybody. Some of you might have experienced what an incredible teacher Ingrid is. If you haven't, you will have an experience of Ingrid in upcoming community of practice meetings. So stay and see what Ingrid has.
Got the level 2 training where you teach this adult levels of development
in March. I have some in March, yeah.
So yeah, and combining it with the Enneagram. So I don't think that came across, that people can learn to work with this stuff with their clients. on the level 2. And
Yeah.
I did that, and it was great. The courses that I'm going to be presenting really soon, I'm presenting a series of courses on each of the types. We had the 7 one last week, and I got really great feedback from that one. The one on 8 is coming up on the 16th of February. You see the contents here. It's not typology basics at all. It's called Into the Wounded Heart, this course series. And a lot of it is focused on the early childhood formation of the reality strategy, and then quite a lot on the pathways of development. And I also cover a lot of the Enneagons that you don't know. So it's the traps, the avoidances, the lies, the anti-self actions. So they're things outside of our usual knowledge of the fixations and the virtues that are very, very helpful to know. If you do want to do the 8 course, you're going to have to let me know soon, because there's about a week of pre-work before each of these courses. And it's quite profound work that you need to digest in small chunks, because this is quite deep work, and it's quite confrontational, as you know the Enneagram can be. So there's that. You can email me about that. And then, sorry, I'm running another round of this course. I think this is about the 4th or the 5th time I'm running it. It's a work and study group with the book The Sacred Enneagram as a departure point. So we work through the book in there are 3 parts to the book, and we work through 1 part a week. And in the 4th week, we will have hangout and coffee virtually with the author, Chris Hurts, who is an incredible teacher, amazingly insightful. Lucille's nodding vigorously. She was at the last one. So if you attend this course, you get to hear him teaching a very illuminating person and book. This book is, he was a student of Richard Rohr's, so he comes from the Christian mystical tradition. But in this course, I also bring in other perspectives from Sufism and Kabbalah. So, you know, to bring a more perennial perspective on some of the themes in this book. So, yeah, I love this book, and I'll probably just keep on teaching it again and again. But yeah, this thing is pretty urgent if you do want to do the 8 course. I give priority to 8s and people with 8 in their tri-type, because it's not so much learning about the 8 type as a transformative process for people who want to work with 8 archetypal issues. So that's what I'm up to in the next few weeks. Cool. Thanks, Renata.
Everybody. So Lucille, if you just to stay and read the chat, because I think we can all agree that was a tremendously valuable session, and thank you for your genius and for your teaching. That was really amazing. I learned a huge amount, and it's just so wonderful to be in this space with all our people. So thanks, Ing. And please read Lucille something about one-on-one work that she does, and I'll send out the slides and the recordings, and look forward to seeing you all next time. Remember, we have
a Friday. Bones. We did that when I was on Vision Quest with Lucille. Krista and I both had a one-on-one bone. Lucille throwing the bones on the carpet. So it's a divination process of where you're at in your life, and I don't think I've gone a day without reflecting on that since we did that. So that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm definitely
recommend
one of those. We're doing sessions on Fridays, which is Friday nights for South Africans and Friday mornings for Americans. So there's one coming up on the 5th of February. If you didn't notice that in the email, it is there. And obviously everybody's welcome. Love you madly. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Lots of love. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. It was lovely being with all of you.
Bye.
Ingrid, are we hanging out for a bit? Where's she gone?
Is she still here, Lynn?
Okay, yeah, we